Well, good morning. And all of you who have gone to get coffee, you need to come back because this will be the best panel of the day. So we're really excited to be here. The trade mission is one of those that in your world doesn't always get a lot of exposure. But this year has been an amazing year for CBP's people, for its capabilities, and for its impact on the global trading order. We have seen 45, I think that's the latest count, White House actions specifically focused on trade. That is an amazing amount of activity. There have been nearly 260 new tariff numbers, which in our world really matters. It's a huge, much greater number than we've ever seen before. CBP has collected over $225 billion in revenue. It's a big number, far bigger than it was when I was with CBP. 150% increase over last year. Lots of enforcement actions, lots of shipment detentions. And my question for the panel today is really, how does that work? And what do you need to do an even better job of enforcing US trade laws? So Brandon, thanks for being here. Let's start with an overview of really what the CBP's trade mission is and the significance of all this tariff activity for DHS and CBP.
Sure, yeah, absolutely, and pleasure to be here. It's good to be with you all this morning and appreciate you all taking time out of your day. So let me just start by saying, we're up here talking about trade. We're really talking about the customs mission, right? And the customs mission in the United States started with the very founding of our country. And the revenue collection that the Customs Service pulled in from the beginning of our republic really powered our growth, largely through arguably the beginning of the 20th or middle of the 20th century. So we've been collecting revenue for a very, very long time. We're very good at it, right? What has changed is not just the scale, the numbers that Brenda mentioned, but also the complexity, right? So historically, it was relatively straightforward on how to calculate a tariff, right? You would just say, what is the product? How much is it worth? Which country is it from? And you do some very basic math with a percentage multiplied by the value of that good. But now what we're increasingly seeing, and this is not just new in the last few months, it's just been turbocharged in the last few months, we're seeing tariffs on components of a finished product, right? So I just want to put a tariff on the steel in the finished thing, right? We're seeing tariffs that are based on end-use provisions, right? You have to pay a tariff on this thing unless you intend to use it for this process, right? We're seeing tariffs on where was the thing originally mined or where was the thing originally melted or poured or formed that goes into a finished good, right? And what that's leading to is super interesting concerns from the trade that frankly concern us. Comments like, well, I don't know where this steel came from in my finished product, but I know it didn't come from Russia, so please don't make me pay the Russia 200% tariff, which is a law enforcement agency for us that's like, just stop and play the tape back for a minute. That's not a convincing enough argument, right? So this is this is the fundamental shift, and it started in 2018 and has continued through to present day, but certainly has been turbocharged in the last few days. And this is like the challenge of the moment in the customs space and in our mission set within CBP. How do we address what I'll just kind of call these new and innovative ways to assess tariffs on products coming into the United States?
Great overview. It really comes down, I think, for CBP to its people, right? And who really is enforcing the law. We have a lot of folks in uniform that do that. And we have a lot of folks who are not in uniform that are really part of the trade team. You work closely with a lot of trade policy agencies, but CBP is where the rubber meets the road because you're the implementers. Can you talk a little bit about who is implementing and kind of what their skill sets are?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll start, and then I'm going to throw it to my colleague Shane Campbell, because we are sort of the two-headed monster here, right? So, what happens when a trade action comes down? The what I call sort of the capital T, capital P trade policy agencies in the U.S. government. So Commerce, USTR, sometimes the Treasury Department. When they make a decision, it comes to CBP to enforce that decision, right? And so when that happens, we have to be savvy enough to examine the legal documents that have established that decision, established that tariff. We have to then figure out how that intersects with our people, our processes, our tools, our own legal authorities, our IT systems, make the updates to those things that are needed, right? And provide guidance to importers and customs brokers on how to comply with that new tariff. And all that has to be done at the speed of executive decision making, which, as Brenda mentioned, we're well over 40 presidential decisions on tariffs in the last 11 months. So we do move very fast. When that is put in place, it comes down to our personnel at our ports of entry in the field, in the Office of Field Operations, to work the actual enforcement of those rules, and frankly, to let us know over on my side if we need to tweak any of those things. And so I'll turn it over to Shane to talk about how that actual enforcement occurs once we get these things put in place.
Sure. So Brandon's probably got the worst job, right? Because he's got to do the policy aspect of this. My job is relatively easy. We have to, like within the Office of Field Operations, particularly in my role within CCS, I have to figure out how to implement that policy at the 328 ports of entry that we have, along with some of our international footprint. And so when you corral over 67,000 employees of CBP and put them into this mission, usually those of us in uniform, like that's who you typically see, right? If you're crossing an international border, or if you see something on National Geographic, they're usually focused on the uniforms, right? And that's CBP officers, agriculture specialists, Border Patrol, Air and Marine, those folks. But really the hub of it are those experts that are behind the scenes, right? My job as an officer is relatively easy. I see a box, I open the box, I think it's suspicious, and then I hold the box, and then I let our true cargo and trade experts come in. That's our import specialists, the entry specialists, trade specialists, and others that come in, laboratories and scientific services. And those are like all the unsung heroes that are helping us make those decisions on the front line. And can't give those folks credit enough, because they allow us to do our job better at protecting this country from bad stuff and bad people coming in. So as they're working to help give us the advice if something is admissible or not admissible, or what to look for, what questions to ask, right? I really can't overstate the importance of what they do and what they bring to CBP as an agency. So that I don't know how deep to go into the enforcement part, because when folks ask me, like even my kids ask me, like, what do you do? And I'm 30 years into this job, I can't, like in a single sentence or paragraph, explain what it is that I do, because it is so varied and so complex. And as we talked about at the very beginning, it changes on a day-to-day basis, right? And I think that's like a key, is that when asked what I do, I probably should just say, I do what it takes to make this country safe and secure. Whether that's in the passenger, the cargo, or any other environment, that's my job, is to try to make this country as secure as we can.
Great, thank you. So let's dig a little deeper and give you a little bit more time to describe the impact on CBP of all this White House activity. And I'm going to ask first Shane and then Eric to talk a bit about what enforcement really looks like at CBP.
Sure. So particularly with the new executive orders that have come out, right? It's new complexities that Brendan explained. It's digging deeper than probably we have been digging. Not saying that necessarily in a bad way, but it's helping us to rethink how we can get better positioned to make sure that we level the playing field for the United States compared to some of our foreign competitors, right? So we dig a little bit deeper into the paperwork, into the actual physical cargo that's in front of us. And to do this at speed, right? Some of the data moves at the speed of electrons, right? That's amazingly fast. And for a lot of our processing, it's literally cleared at the speed of electrons. So we have to make sure, like when I talk about those specialists, those hidden folks behind the scenes, like our OIT programmers and all those other folks, they have to make sure that those algorithms are set just right, that the keys that they put in our system for us to look for are just right. So I'm really sure, what am I missing here?
I think, so really just kind of echoing behind Shane and Brandon in the sense that, when we looked at, the new America First trade policy is really put trade at the forefront of the national security as a key part of national security. It's economic security, which is national security. And really what that has changed fundamentally is that trade enforcement has really come to the forefront, and not only here within the agency, but within the department and broadly across the federal interagency has really coalesced more or less to really come together to really look at those things that Shane had mentioned, right? Where does economic security, we're at the intersection of economic security, the different roles and responsibilities across the various departments and agencies, how do we intersect, how do we work better together to really chip away at this trade enforcement mission, right, collectively. But within the agency, broadly, trade enforcement is done across the agency. So not any one office, not any one branch or division is focused on trade enforcement. They all are a fundamental piece of the overall cog of enforcing the trade mission. Where things that has changed with regards to the America First trade policy and the agency's renewed focus on putting enforcement up at the forefront is leveraging all those available authorities that the agency has to bear to enforce against those that are violating trade, that are committing trade fraud, and those are looking to evade the duties that are due to the country, right? So things like our forced labor enforcement authorities, those are things that one has driven over the past couple of years, has driven renewed look at supply chains, right, which has now been somewhat prescient in the sense that that has driven industries, those that are looking to comply and conduct lawful trade to create tools and advanced tools that give a deeper look into where things are pulled out of the ground, where things are pulled out of the sea, because that supply chain visibility is required at time of entry. And those are also things that level the playing field between U.S. businesses and the way businesses conduct business overseas and create unfair competition. So these things that we're doing really is focusing on collecting the revenue is first and foremost, right? And then focusing on protecting the U.S. consumers, really those things that whether it's counterfeit goods or things like that are produced with forced labor are creating safety issues for the U.S. consumers. Also protecting U.S. industry, making sure that we're leveling the playing field, but then also chasing after it and leveraging the maximum tools to put consequences on those who are looking to defraud the government and evade the duties that are due to the government. And that's how we work broadly together with not only on the policy side, but also with our operators in the field, but also in those authorities that we have within the agency to bring to bear.
Great, thanks, Eric. I think that's a good overview. And I think what I want to do is go off script a little bit and maybe take a step back and give our audience a better understanding of the field organization. How is CBP on the trade side organized? They know Border Patrol stations. They know ports of entry. But who else is out there that enforces the law? And then, Eric, I'm going to ask you to dig a little bit deeper on those issues. You talked about counterfeit goods, but let's give a little bit more understanding of what those laws are about and what are the big chunks of risk. So maybe, Shane, if we could start with you.
Sure. So if we want to go at the port of entry level and go beyond our officers and agriculture specialists, right? We also have our centers of excellence and expertise, which houses our import specialists, entry specialists, drawback specialists. There's a conversation to like go down with drawback, right? Nobody ever wants to talk
Nobody wants to talk about drawback.
So we're not going to talk about drawback here either. But our import specialists play a vital role in the cargo and trade environment. Like they are the ones, I'll use textiles as an example, right? They are the ones who will dig into like containers with us, rolls and rolls of fabrics, and they can help us determine, hey, this was declared as 100% cotton. And they help us find, is it really 100% cotton, or is it 80% cotton, 20% of something else, or other percentages? And that really helps make the determination as to whether or not, like, what the duty rates are, or if somebody is violating our anti-dumping, countervailing duties issues that we see on a frequent basis. Those are the specialists that I talked about in the very beginning that help, like they have different training. They have a different academy than we do as CBP officers. So they really know how to dig into the weeds. And then of course we have our laboratories and scientific services folks who, when we really have to go even deeper and we have to do analysis or pollen testing or getting into like fiber counts and things, like we can turn to our LSS counterparts who help us do that work.
I love that you picked up on the laboratories and scientific services, because I know every trade person really relies on their analysis for things like origin. Where did this good actually come from?
Right.
In my time, that for us, figuring out and confirming origin, where did that good actually come from, was a huge issue.
And that's crucial, right? So, well, like with what's in the news recently, and we talk about oil, and where does oil come from? Our LSS folks can tell us which regions of the world that oil is coming from on the tankers. They dig deeper than I think most people expect, and they can give us really valuable information that not only protect the revenue, but also help the government enforce sanctions and other types of enforcement actions and revenue collection.
And so certainly, the laboratory and scientific services, certainly they explore all available, cutting edge technologies, working together with national labs and also capability providers as well to see what latest capabilities are available. Things that, both as Shane and Brandon had mentioned, are important to understand. When we talk about, some of the biggest challenges all kind of really go back to the origin and supply chain of the goods. So if we're talking about a specific tariff on a specific portion of a good, that necessarily, like say the steel content within a good, then understanding how that steel content is represented and how the tariff calculation is being done may or may not necessarily be accurately represented by the importer, may not be known by the importer, right? They may be taking representations based upon what was represented to them. And so being able to identify not only the origin of the goods, but all those that had a hand in the supply chain of making that good. I mean, if you talk about, like, a piece of machinery is fairly complex, but say going back to something more simple, say like a shirt, most folks would think, okay, well, shirt, probably went, you had fabric going to a factory, and then that shirt was just sewn together and then shipped to the United States, right? But it really goes back to, like, where was the cotton pulled out of the ground, right? Who had a hand in spinning that cotton, making the thread, making the fabrics, and then where those fabrics go to make the specific portions of the shirt, like the pockets, the different panels, could all come from different manufacturers and different sources, especially if we're looking at the lowest cost available for those that are manufacturing them. So understanding how that's all put together, how that all lends into the duty calculations. There may be free trade agreements that affect that as well, right? Based upon where specific panels or threads come from that are part of where that shirt is being manufactured. And all that is something that needs to be accurately represented by the manufacturer, by the importer at time of entry, so we understand that we're collecting the appropriate tariff rate, that the goods that's coming in ultimately is admissible into the United States.
And we've seen, I think, that was a great description of, you take a shirt that most of us wear on a daily basis and really trying to break it down into where did it actually come from is a challenge not only for CBP, but it's also a challenge for the private sector, because the expectation is that the U.S. importer will know where that shirt came from. And now it is not only where was the factory that actually sewed that shirt together located, but where did the pieces come from? Where did the basic materials come from? And so the onus on proving to CBP really falls on that US importer. And so as I think about the technology for origin verification, certification, it is not important only to the government, but it's also important to the hundreds of thousands of US importers that are responsible for knowing the origin of their products. Could you give us a little bit of a view on what is the technology that you're using around origin? And from my perspective, I think it's a mix of testing, and you've put out some great guidance on isotopic testing, but it's also AI comes into play. Could you talk a little bit about those technologies, any of the three of you, but maybe we'll start with Eric.
Well, certainly, I think, again, we're looking more broadly. Nothing can, at this point in time, nothing really kind of makes up for the human, on the ground, right? Our import specialists, our officers on the ground, looking, having that day-to-day relationship with the importers, with the manufacturers, having those accounts and looking at the importations coming in and day out, and understanding what the environment looks at, and understanding when potentially an anomaly within those supply chains occur. And that's what's occurring generally on a day in and day out basis at our ports of entry and at the centers of excellence. Now, certainly, there are a lot of avenues by which allegations come in, or awareness that maybe fraud could be occurring, or some type of verification that we could be doing just generally on a specific commodity within specific supply chains. And and when we work together with the importer who is working with his or her manufacturers or their manufacturers, it really goes back to one, the paperwork. And right now it's relatively rudimentary in that sense, where the transactional paperwork between manufacturers, all those that had a hand within the supply chain, is critical to demonstrate provenance of the goods and where the goods originated from. So whether it's the cotton, going back to the shirt example, like understanding where the cotton came from, what field it came out of, who had a hand in spinning it, and things like the purchase orders, the transportation documents, 2 or 3 of those things that represent kind of that transaction between business-to-business transactions are things that importers are having to show to the centers and the ports to demonstrate the origin of those goods, right? And then there's also, as Shane had mentioned, the scientific pieces, where when we look at things that not necessarily where we can look at scientifically and through forensic process of understanding where that raw material actually came out of the ground, that maybe there's other areas like the pollen analysis or the dust analysis that's on top of a specific piece of equipment that could be analyzed that says, well, this pollen only exists in this part of the world, so potentially this thing probably came from this area. Or there is technology that shows that things like for cotton or even like petroleum-based goods, where you could do some type of scientific forensic analysis that shows that there is a specific like isotopic content within these goods that show that it most likely came from this region of the world. And these are all things, and then ultimately, then looking at the overall data, right? We have mass volumes of data, not only us, but across the private sector. I mean, the industry has mass amounts of data that we're not necessarily at AI. I mean, we look at process automations that can kind of condense down the volume of data that we have, that gives us some ability to look at how things are kind of traveling through supply chains, how the business-to-business interactions are occurring, that give us a general idea of that whether a good did actually come from a specific area or a specific company as represented in the documentation that comes in.
Excellent. Really good picture, I think, of what the challenges that you're dealing with, and then some of the tools that you're using to address those challenges. Shane, I'm going to, again, go off script and ask you to give another facet of the environment around the data. So Eric talked about all of the data that is looked at.
Yes.
But in your world, and I know that when Deputy Commissioner talked about the National Targeting Center, there has been great synergy between the anti-terrorism mission and the trade mission. The connection is the data. Can you talk a little bit about the data that CBP collects related to shipments and how it's used by CBP and how that impacts kind of trade security or economic security? And maybe, just to throw in, he addressed the de minimis concept. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the specific challenges there.
Oh, wow. Oh, I see Brandon's giving me the look at this because he knows how much I love talking about this topic. So I'm going to take the data, I'm going to build off of Eric's thing, and I may or may not answer your question directly, and hold me to that if I don't, right? Because I do want to go back and talk about the use of AI and hit on something that Eric touched on briefly, right? Which is, time and time again, and I'm going to caveat this to where I'm a fan of AI, but I'm a fan of AI up to a point, right? Because we have a notion, or when we talk about AI, it makes people nervous because it's going to replace humans, it's going to replace workers, et cetera, et cetera. And I can tell you in my line of work, no. Because test after test after test has shown that when you take the human capital part out of the AI and test us as people, we're much better and we perform much better, right? Now, is there a chance that 20 years down the road that AI can get better? Okay, maybe, but AI just doesn't have the same synapses and stuff that we have in our brains, and therefore can't do the reasoning, et cetera, that we get, correct? So, this goes back to complex, right? Which was in its way a light form of AI of just doing random examples, right? And it's still an algorithm, although a very simplistic algorithm. And time after time over, we've been doing complex exams, I've been in 30 years, and it's way longer than 30 years that CBP officers are much better than the technology. So I'll just hit that one right there. When it comes to data, I'm gonna turn your example to something that may be, at least in my head, easier to explain. We have a CTPAT program, Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism, with 11,000 members, and those members kind of guarantee that they are protecting their supply chain. It's a very rigorous application process. In fact, the application for us to do one new CTPAT partner applying for the program, it's about a 4 to 5 month process for us to go through a validation process. And the biggest time constraint on that is going through the hundreds, if not thousands, of pages of documents that are presented to our supply chain security specialist, who are reviewing those companies, going through their books, and really getting into the weeds of the business operations of that company. So when you have an individual who's got to go through thousands of pages of documents looking to make sure that every question was answered, that commas aren't out of place, that the appropriate information matches the question, or that the question has actually been answered and not just fluff, trying to fill in words to make it look like questions were answered, right? We've done testing with AI showing that AI can help us do that clerical review process at a rate of 60% faster than what our supply chain security specialist can do on its own. So it really can go through and just flag those particular areas that we really need to look at and dig deeper into because questions weren't answered or just omitted on its face, right? That saves tens, 20s, hundreds of hours of time that our supply chain security specialists don't get stuck reviewing paperwork, but they can actually go out and do physical validations of the companies and their supply chains that better protect the supply chain of the United States, right? So if you take that and link that in with the billions of bytes of data that the NTC is dealing with on a day-to-day basis, if you can bring that concept up to that level too, where AI is helping with our algorithms to look for those anomalies and targeting that to AI looks weird, but then we officers, other specialists step in to really look at that and to dig a little deeper to make sure, is it really weird or is it something we truly have to be worried about? Does that answer your?
It gets there. It gets there. So you collect, CBP collects data in advance
Correct.
Of a shipment actually arriving. And you're doing reviews at that point. Goods actually arrive. And you're looking again to make sure there's no bomb in that box or that there are no counterfeit tennis shoes in that shipping container. and then you do reviews after. My sense is that the tools that CBP is using to check the algorithms, to flag the risky shipments, so we know which shipping containers or small packages really need to be opened up, or perhaps x-rayed, or run through a radiation portal monitor, is really important. But what I'm seeing over time as CBP develops new tools is the expectations for the private sector on applying those tools. You have anything you want to add? And Brandon, I'm going to give you a chance maybe to build on what your colleagues have said, and then.
Yeah, sure. So, Shane's absolutely right about, the use of AI and our CTPAT program. The unique challenge in the custom space and the trade space is, we're trying to do two things. We're trying to protect our national economic security from imports that unfairly undercut or harm our domestic industries, and we're trying to keep fake, counterfeit, or unsafe products out of the country, from entering the country. The problem is, the core challenge is, all of that harm, all that activity is frankly finalized overseas and then sent here. And then when the harm gets here, it's a thing that doesn't talk to you, right? It's a product. And so it doesn't look nervous when you interview it. It can't tell you where it traveled in the last 6 months, right? I'm not an immigration guy, right? But we've all sort of processed through an airport, right? We can't do that, right? So being able to take the data that we get pre-arrival, or the data that we get through open source, and being able to link it in new ways to the people behind these activities further helps our mission. And so what we're saying to industry now is, hey, there is a wealth of open source data that has never existed at this scale now, right? To say that you no longer know is increasingly not an acceptable answer. At the same time, though, we're also asking industry, what sort of industry standards or tools that you are using to answer these questions that we can potentially leverage. We very much don't want to get into a scenario where, as a customs authority, we're imposing some sort of a traceability, you must do it exactly this way standard, or some other sort of data format or tool that you must adopt and take on costs. What we're asking broadly is, what tools are out there for supply chain tracing? What tools or standards are you using to better understand and see into that supply chain, to better understand origin? And oh, by the way, we're probably going to want to increasingly know a little bit more about who the people are behind these companies. Because one thing we haven't talked about is shell companies. And that's a whole nother challenge. And the shell company problem is super simple. Very easy to establish companies in the United States with limited information. Those companies are set up for one purpose: to evade US trade laws, okay? And people think, oh, this should be easy. It's not easy, because they pay the money that they owe us, right? It would be easy if they just skipped town and didn't pay. They don't skip town until we find them, right? And then when we find them and realize they owe us money, now they're gone. But the truth is, they've probably set up other shell companies and they're just waiting to show up as a brand new company, right? So data and verifiable credentials, you'll hear some people talk about that, but really the data, knowing the people and the entities that are behind these companies, what they're really doing overseas, what processes they're leveraging overseas, all that data combined with open source data is going to increasingly help us. Because again, imagine you open up your box shipped to your door of whatever you or your spouse or your kids ordered, and you had to find out from that box, where exactly were you manufactured, right? The box won't tell you anything, right? And so our officers and our import specialists, that's what they have to work with, plus whatever data we can get them, right? And that's the core challenge of the time, right? That is what we're faced with today.
Brenda, I'm going to add in, because you mentioned de minimis in your last question,
Yep.
and I tried to do the headquarters thing of going around it, right? But it plays into what Brandon's saying, and de minimis is a perfect example of that, right? Because this was an environment, for those of you not familiar with de minimis, that allowed the passing of anything under $800 coming into the United States to clear duty-free, essentially, right? And that changed just a few months ago. And when the announcements came out, you would have thought that the world was going to end, right? And that was the consternation that we were getting from trade industry, from carriers, name your field across the cargo and trade environment. And there was a lot of consternation about the end of this. The world didn't stop spinning, because as our push to get more data from our trade partners, they did it. They're coming back, right? Mail is a perfect example of that, where, and I'm going to say this too, like in the de minimis environment, that was like the bulk of our seizures. It was something like 90+% of our seizures by counts happened in the de minimis environment. There were some true threats there because we weren't getting the information and data that we could use to pre-screen and to pre-clear some of this stuff that was coming through. And when you're talking about over 4 million shipments a day coming into the United States, that's a lot of stuff to look at. That's a lot, right? And usually when we talk about de minimis, a lot of folks focus on mail, right? Mail was only 5% of the de minimis volume. That was shocking to some folks, who learned that mail wasn't all de minimis. It was only 5%. And Brandon and I joked that, but about 95% of our problems do, right? And that, like, mail became especially contentious because data in mail is difficult, right? And we've made arguments that, hey, look, mail is mail. And we fully understand the history and the importance of mail, right? And particularly for the United States and the founding of our country, when our founding fathers were trying to make planning, they were using mail. They were sending letters back and forth. When, how do you do that today? Well, you still can, but mail has kind of gone into a cargo environment. When they picked up e-commerce, and foreign postal operators around the world picked up e-commerce to ship, and that's their money-making business, because, okay, stamps are, here in the US, they're expensive, in other parts of the world, not so expensive. You're not making a whole lot of money on that, but you are on, when you're picking up, name your online retailer, and you're shipping stuff around the world, that's big money. So when we ask for more data, hey, the data's there. It was just our postal operators weren't equipped to get the data. They are now, because over 85% of the countries are now back to shipping mail back to the United States full force.
Great example of kind of one of the big risks on the top of your list and what you've had to deal with. All right, so lightning round, because we want to give maybe just a couple of minutes for Q&A. Lightning round. If you could wave a magic wand and ask for a new tool, a new capability, what would it be? Eric, I'm going to start with you, then we'll do Shane, and Brandon will let you have the last word.
Yeah, I'll just start off the top with just kind of adding to another risk that we haven't talked about is the illegal transshipment risk. And certainly a lot of things that we are challenged with is the fact that, again, going back to country of origin verification, making sure that what is represented at time of entry for specific goods is from a specific country that is being declared by the importer. So, transshipment is a normal part of global trade. Something comes on is made, say, in a specific country, goes to another country as a route of transit, maybe gets off of that ship and gets put on another ship and then goes to its ultimate destination. But there's illegal transshipment where potentially that comes off, that it gets manufactured in a specific country, goes in transit to another country, gets stamped as being made in that country. That's something fairly simple. The box gets stamped, made in that country, and then gets sent to, say, the United States as the ultimate destination, and then gets represented as being made in country Y, has a lower tariff rate, right? So that's a fairly simple evasion scheme. Other things where we see where parts are being transshipped, or they go to a specific country to be assembled, and then it's being represented as coming from country Y. But the rules of origin say that, well, if it's being assembled in this country, then it has to be represented as coming from country X. And so in those instances, we have to potentially send folks on the ground, and we have to look under the hood, maybe look within the piece of machinery, and you may find parts that are stamped made in country X when it's being represented as country Y. And so all these things are things that, there are methods that you can't really take the human out of the loop, right? I mean, it really requires folks to get on their hands and knees, look under the hood, look at the pieces of fabric and the equipment to understand the actual origin. But so if what we're really kind of pursuing right now is looking at the technologies, one where we can leverage technologies again to better understand how trade is flowing and whether trade is that as it's being represented to the agency is actually truly representative of what's occurring. So I think if I were king for the day and could snap my fingers, really what I would really want to actually get pursue as an end state, I believe that AI ultimately is going to play a critical role in what we do day in and day out, in the sense that one, I think it's functional in the sense that a lot of the processes that we do are still fairly manual or are labor intensive, right? So being able to cut down some of that process time to make us more agile in our enforcement, but segmenting wise, what we know with regards to data, like where we see like global shipments and where we see container movements and what we actually see represented on the ground, a lot of that is capabilities they segment, where we can have a transparent view at certain points in time to show that, yes, this was here or this is where it was manufactured at a certain point in time, but something that brings it all together, right? Maybe in the future where there could be some predictive analysis or some predictive things that'll help our investigators, our analysts, but then also not only, one of the things that we hadn't mentioned is we do have a significant body of auditors, I think is our largest footprint within the Office of Trade, who are looking through and also pouring through, as our import specialists are doing, pouring through thousands and thousands of pages of business transaction documents, purchase orders, movement documents, and so something that really, again, shrinks the haystack and shortens the time that we're able to enforce.
You're not asking for much.
Yeah, no.
I'm going to go very fast. Supply chain security, visibility, and traceability from supplier to manufacturer to ultimate consignee. If I can get that, I literally can clear trade and cargo at the speed of electrons, because we know we can validate and we can make it safe so that when we can truly focus on the threats that the U.S. is facing.
Excellent. Okay, Brandon?
Yeah, everything both of them said, plus the capability to spot these shell companies, frankly, before they've run up a bill, right? Frankly, before they've spotted harm. And then just want to second on the supply chain tracing. The ultimate goal here is, as we increase operational efficiency, and what I mean by that is, if we stop cargo, we need to strive to be as sure as possible that we will find a violation. And so tools that drive that intelligence up.
And the private sector would welcome not being the needle in the haystack. And so I think using tools for traceability and making sure that they are compliant is also really important. You've done a great job giving us a view into the trade mission at CBP. I'd like to thank you. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions, but we will live to fight another day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.